I watched in horror as Sheriff Corinne pulled a small plastic bag from behind my grill and held it up for the cameras. The white powder inside caught the afternoon sunlight as she turned to the state investigators with that same cold smirk she had worn for months. "Found it right where I thought it would be," she announced loudly, making sure every neighbor could hear. But what she did not know was that I had been recording everything. And that bag, I knew exactly where it really came from. 3 months earlier, life was simple. Every Saturday morning, I would wake up before dawn and fire up the smoker I had built with my own hands in my backyard. The smell of hickory wood and slow-cooking meat was my meditation, my way of bringing peace to what had become a chaotic world. My modest home sat on Maple Street in the heart of our small town, where everyone knew everyone and neighbors still looked out for each other. The smoker was my pride and joy, constructed from an old propane tank and welded with careful precision over several weekends. When that sweet smoke started rolling, it was like sending out an invitation to the entire neighborhood. By noon, my backyard would transform into something magical. My wife Sarah would set up folding tables under the old oak tree, while our 8-year-old daughter Emma ran through the sprinkler with the other kids from down the street. The sound of laughter mixed with the sizzle of ribs and brisket created a symphony that made all the stress of the week disappear. "Honey, the Johnsons are here," Sarah called out as I pulled a perfect rack of ribs from the smoker. The meat was tender enough to fall off the bone, with a beautiful bark that had taken 6 hours to develop. Old Mr. Peterson from next door always brought his famous potato salad, while the Martinez family contributed homemade salsa that could wake the dead. These were not just meals. They were celebrations of community, of the simple joy that comes from sharing food with people you care about. But even in those perfect moments, I noticed her watching. Sheriff Corinne lived in the house directly behind mine, separated only by a chain-link fence that had stood there for 20 years without causing any problems. She was new to the neighborhood, having moved in just 6 months earlier after getting promoted to sheriff of our county. At first, I thought she was just shy, maybe waiting for an invitation to join us. I was wrong. Every Saturday, as the smoke began to rise and the laughter grew louder, I would catch glimpses of her standing at her kitchen window. She never waved back when I offered a friendly gesture. Instead, she would pull out her phone and start taking pictures, writing notes on a small pad she always kept nearby. "Maybe she is just documenting the neighborhood," Sarah suggested when I mentioned it. "New job, new house, probably just being thorough." But something about the way she watched us felt different. It was not curiosity or even annoyance. It was calculation, like she was building a case against us before we had even committed a crime. The first warning sign came on a particularly beautiful Saturday in late spring. The whole neighborhood had turned out, including several families I had not seen in months. Kids were playing games in the yard, while adults shared stories and cold drinks under the shade of my oak tree. That is when I saw her approaching with a measuring tape and clipboard, walking across the yard like she owned it. She was not in uniform, but everything about her posture screamed authority and disapproval. The laughter died as she got closer, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. The next Saturday, Sheriff Corinne did not bother with civilian clothes. She appeared at my backyard gate in full uniform, complete with badge, radio, and the kind of serious expression that could ruin any party. The timing was perfect from her perspective and devastating from mine. We were right in the middle of our busiest gathering of the year, with nearly 30 neighbors enjoying what I considered my best brisket ever. "Excuse me," she announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. I need to speak with the homeowner about several violations I have observed. The conversation stopped. Kids paused their games. Even the music seemed to quiet itself as all eyes turned toward us. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over with what I hoped was a calm, respectful demeanor. "Good afternoon, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" She pulled out the same clipboard I had seen her carrying the week before, now filled with notes and what appeared to be official forms. "I have documented multiple noise violations, potential fire safety hazards, and what appears to be commercial food preparation without proper permits." She read from her notes like she was giving testimony in court. I felt my face flush, but I kept my voice steady. "Sheriff, this is just a family gathering. We have been doing this for years without any problems. All of my neighbors are welcome and everything is prepared safely. The smoke from your grill is crossing property lines and creating a nuisance," she continued, ignoring my explanation. "I have also observed cars parked on the street without proper permits, and the noise level exceeds municipal ordinances for residential areas." Behind her, I could see Mrs. Rodriguez slowly packing up her family's things, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Mr. Peterson looked like he wanted to say something but stayed silent, staring down at his potato salad. "Sheriff, would you like to join us?" I asked, gesturing toward the picnic table loaded with food. "I think if you tried the brisket, you would understand why people keep coming back. This is about community, not violations." For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Not softness exactly, but maybe recognition that she was looking at a table full of food made with love and shared with joy. Then the moment passed, and her expression hardened again. "I am not here to socialize. I am here to inform you that continued violations will result in citations and potential legal action." She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of everything: the smoker, the tables, the guests, even the children playing in the sprinkler. Each flash felt like a slap, turning our celebration into evidence for some unknown crime. "This is harassment," Sarah said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Sheriff Corinne turned to my wife with the kind of look that could freeze water. "Ma'am, I suggest you be very careful about making accusations against a law enforcement officer." The threat was clear, and the silence that followed was deafening. One by one, our neighbors began making excuses and gathering their things. Within 20 minutes, my backyard was empty except for my family and the lingering smell of what should have been a perfect Saturday. As Sheriff Corinne walked back toward her house, she paused at the fence line and turned back. "Next week, I will be conducting regular patrols of this area. I suggest you consider indoor entertainment." That night, after Emma was asleep and the dishes were washed, I sat on my back porch staring at the cold smoker. Sarah joined me with 2 cups of coffee, and we watched the stars appear over our quiet neighborhood. "She cannot do this, can she?" Sarah asked. I wished I had an answer that would make her feel better. Instead, all I could think about was the look of satisfaction on Sheriff Corinne's face as she watched our friends hurry away. Sheriff Corinne had tasted blood, and she wanted more. What started as weekend harassment quickly became a daily nightmare that invaded every aspect of our lives. She began driving past our house multiple times each day, sometimes slowing down to take pictures, other times stopping to measure distances between our cars and the curb. The first citation arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by Deputy Martinez, a young officer who looked embarrassed to be serving it. "Violation of Municipal Noise Ordinance, Section 12.4, he read reluctantly. Complaint filed Saturday evening regarding excessive noise levels during prohibited hours. What prohibited hours? I asked, genuinely confused. We cleaned up by 8 o'clock and it was still daylight. Deputy Martinez shrugged. I am just delivering the citation, sir. You can contest it in court if you want. The fine was $200 for a backyard barbecue that ended before sunset. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, citations appeared for everything imaginable. A trash can positioned 6 inches too close to the street, a garden hose left connected to the spigot overnight, even a parking violation because my truck's tire was allegedly touching the grass strip between the sidewalk and curb. Each citation came with Deputy Martinez, looking more uncomfortable than the last. "This is crazy," he finally whispered during his 4th visit. "I have to deliver these, but between you and me, this is not what I signed up for." The psychological warfare was even worse than the fines. Sheriff Corinne began timing her patrols to coincide with our daily routines. When Emma walked to the school bus stop, Corinne would be parked at the corner with her window down, watching and taking notes. When Sarah went grocery shopping, Corinne would follow at a distance, always staying just far enough away to avoid being obvious but close enough to make her presence felt. Our neighbors started avoiding us. The daily waves and friendly conversations stopped. When I walked down the street, people would suddenly remember urgent tasks that required them to go inside. The Martinez family, who had never missed a Saturday barbecue, stopped coming outside when we were in our yard. "They are scared," Sarah observed one evening as we watched Mrs. Rodriguez rush her children inside when she saw us on our porch. She was right. In a small town, the sheriff's word carried enormous weight. If Corinne had decided we were troublemakers, most people would rather stay away than risk becoming targets themselves. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in June. Emma was playing in our backyard with her friend Katie from down the street when I heard sirens approaching. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of our house, and Sheriff Corinne emerged from the first one with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Child Protective Services complaint," she announced as I met her at the front door. "Allegations of child endangerment due to ongoing exposure to hazardous smoke and unsafe food preparation conditions." My world stopped. Through the window, I could see Emma and Katie frozen in the backyard, their game of hopscotch forgotten as they stared at the police cars. "You called CPS on us." The words came out as barely a whisper. "I called in a legitimate concern about children being exposed to potentially dangerous conditions," Corinne replied with practiced bureaucratic language. "The investigation will determine if action is necessary." The CPS worker was a tired-looking woman named Ms. Thompson, who seemed to understand immediately that she was being used as a weapon in someone else's war. She went through the motions of inspecting our house, asking gentle questions about Emma's health and safety, and reviewing our kitchen and backyard. "Everything looks fine here," she concluded after an hour. "I see no evidence of endangerment or unsafe conditions." But the damage was done. Word spread quickly through our small town that CPS had been called to our house. Parents began keeping their children away from Emma. Invitations to birthday parties and sleepovers stopped coming. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Daddy, why does Sheriff Corinne hate us?" I did not have an answer for my 8-year-old daughter, but I knew I had to find one, and I knew it had to involve making Corinne's harassment stop. As I sat in my kitchen after everyone was asleep, staring at the stack of citations and legal papers that had taken over our dining room table, I made a decision that would change everything. If Sheriff Karen wanted to play games with my family's safety and happiness, then it was time to change the rules. I started with Mrs. Rodriguez. She had been our neighbor for 5 years, and I remembered the way she used to light up when Emma played with her grandchildren in our backyard. But since the harassment began, she had barely made eye contact when we passed on the street. I found her working in her garden on a quiet Tuesday morning, when the street was empty and Sheriff Karen's patrol car was nowhere to be seen. "Maria," I called softly as I approached her fence, "can we talk?" She looked around nervously before nodding and gesturing for me to come closer. "I know you have been avoiding us," I said gently, "and I understand why, but I need to ask you something important. Has Sheriff Karen ever bothered you or your family?" The relief that washed over her face told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. "Oh, thank God you asked," she whispered, glancing around again to make sure we could not be overheard. "I thought I was going crazy. She has been harassing us for months about everything. Parking tickets that make no sense, noise complaints when we have family over, even threats about our small business license." Maria owned a small catering company that she ran from her home kitchen, specializing in traditional Mexican food for local events. It was completely legal and properly licensed, but Sheriff Karen had been using every bureaucratic weapon she could find to make Maria's life miserable. "She told me that complaints had been filed about smells coming from my cooking," Maria continued, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "She said if I did not stop operating my business, she would have to investigate further. But I need that income. My husband is disabled, and this is how we survive." That conversation opened the floodgates. Within a week, I had quietly spoken with 8 different neighbors, and every single one had a story about Sheriff Karen's abuse of power. Tom, the Vietnam veteran who lived 3 blocks away, had been threatened with citations because his American flag was allegedly displayed improperly. Sarah, who owned the small flower shop downtown, described shakedown tactics where Karen would find minor violations and hint that they could disappear if Sarah was more cooperative with law enforcement fundraising efforts. The most disturbing story came from the Hendersons, an elderly couple who had lived in town for 40 years. Karen had convinced them that their late-night television watching was disturbing neighbors, then used their confusion and fear to search their house without a warrant, claiming she smelled marijuana. "We do not even drink alcohol," Mrs. Henderson told me with tears in her eyes, "but she made us feel like criminals in our own home." Each story followed the same pattern. Sheriff Karen would identify someone she perceived as vulnerable or different, then use her position to harass and intimidate them until they either moved away or became too frightened to cause any trouble. We began meeting secretly at the small coffee shop on the edge of town, always at different times and in small groups to avoid suspicion. Tom, with his military background, helped us organize our evidence and document everything systematically. "This is bigger than personal grudges," he said during one of our gatherings. "This is systematic abuse of power, and it violates federal civil rights laws." Maria brought her business license documentation and the threatening letters Karen had sent through official channels. Sarah provided financial records showing how her business had suffered since Karen began targeting her with frequent inspections and violation threats. But the most valuable contribution came from an unexpected source. Jenny, who worked as a dispatcher for the county sheriff's department, had been listening to our conversations and finally approached me after a particularly emotional meeting. "I cannot be seen talking to you," she said quietly as we stood in the parking lot after everyone else had left. But you need to know that there are recordings of everything. Every radio call, every official complaint, every interaction with citizens gets recorded and stored. She handed me a small piece of paper with a phone number written on it. Call this number. It is a state police internal affairs investigator. Tell him you have multiple civil rights complaints and documented evidence of systematic harassment by a local sheriff. As I drove home that night with the phone number burning a hole in my pocket, I realized that what had started as a personal attack on my family had revealed something much larger and more dangerous. Sheriff Karen had been using her badge as a weapon against anyone who did not fit her narrow definition of an acceptable citizen. But she had made one critical mistake. She had united her victims. The law office of James Crawford looked nothing like what I had expected. Instead of intimidating legal books and formal furniture, it felt more like a comfortable living room where serious conversations happened to take place. Crawford was a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases, and Tom had found him through his connections with veteran advocacy groups. When I called the number Jenny had given me, the state investigator had recommended Crawford as someone who understood both the legal complexities and the emotional toll of fighting corrupt law enforcement. What you are describing is a textbook case of civil rights violations under federal law, Crawford explained, as he reviewed the thick folder of evidence we had compiled. Section 1983 allows citizens to sue government officials who abuse their power under color of law. He spread our documentation across his conference table. Photographs of Karen conducting unnecessary searches, copies of frivolous citations, witness statements from multiple victims, and most importantly, Jenny's information about recorded radio communications. The key is establishing a pattern of systematic harassment rather than isolated incidents, Crawford continued. Sheriff Karen has been using her official position to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. That is a federal crime. But he also warned us about the challenges ahead. Small-town politics can be incredibly complex, he said. Sheriff Karen likely has supporters in local government, maybe even at the state level. We need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. Crawford's strategy was methodical and brilliant. First, we would file complaints with the State Police Internal Affairs Division, providing them with all our documented evidence. Simultaneously, he would submit a formal complaint to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, since federal jurisdiction applied when local law enforcement violated constitutional rights. But the most important element was what he called public accountability. Corruption thrives in shadows, Crawford explained. The best way to stop a corrupt official is to force their actions into the light where everyone can see them. That was when I came up with the idea that would change everything. What if we invited the entire police department to a barbecue? Crawford looked at me like I had lost my mind. I am sorry, what? Think about it, I continued, the plan forming in my mind as I spoke. Sheriff Karen has been telling everyone that I am some kind of dangerous troublemaker who hosts illegal gatherings. What if we invited every law enforcement officer in the county to come see for themselves? The brilliance of the idea became clear as we talked it through. A public invitation to all law enforcement would serve multiple purposes. It would demonstrate that I had nothing to hide. It would force Karen to either attend and face questions or stay away and look guilty. And it would create a public forum where her victims could share their stories with officers who might not be aware of her behavior. We make it completely transparent, I said, getting excited about the possibilities. Social media, local newspaper, Open invitation to anyone who wants to come. If she really believes I am doing something wrong, she should have no problem with other officers seeing it firsthand. Crawford smiled for the first time since we had met. That is either completely insane or absolutely brilliant. Maybe both, Tom added, but it could work. We spent the next 2 hours planning every detail. The timing would be crucial. Crawford would file the state police complaint and FBI referral on a Friday, ensuring that the investigation would be active when the barbecue took place the following Saturday. This would give the investigators a perfect opportunity to observe Corinne's behavior in a public setting, while also seeing the community she had been terrorizing. I would create a social media post explaining exactly what had been happening, including photos and documentation of Corinne's harassment, followed by a genuine invitation for any law enforcement officer to come enjoy free food and meet the neighbors Corinne claimed were problems. The beauty of this approach, Crawford explained, is that it forces everyone to choose sides publicly. Officers who attend will see the truth about you and your community. Officers who stay away will have to explain why they refused a peaceful invitation to meet concerned citizens. But the most important element was timing it with the media attention. Crawford had contacts at the local newspaper and television station who would be interested in a story about community policing and transparency. When this goes public, Sheriff Corinne will have two choices, he said. She can attend and risk having her victims confront her in front of witnesses and cameras, or she can stay away and look like she has something to hide. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope that the harassment would stop, but hope that we could actually make things better for everyone in our community who had been suffering in silence. The plan was risky, but it was also the right thing to do. And sometimes, doing the right thing is the only choice that lets you sleep at night. I spent 3 hours writing that social media post, rewriting it until every word felt exactly right. The video I recorded in my backyard was simple but powerful. I stood next to my smoker with the fence between our properties clearly visible, speaking directly to the camera with the kind of calm honesty that comes from knowing you are telling the truth. My name is Mike Thompson, and I live on Maple Street here in town. For the past 3 months, Sheriff Corinne Williams has been systematically harassing my family and our neighbors for the crime of having backyard barbecues and building community connections. I held up the stack of frivolous citations, letting the camera focus on the ridiculous violations. Trash can positioned incorrectly, garden hose connected overnight, tire allegedly touching grass. She has called Child Protective Services on my family, followed my wife to the grocery store, and threatened our neighbors until they are afraid to be seen talking to us. All because she does not like the smell of barbecue smoke. Then came the invitation that would change everything. So this Saturday at noon, I am hosting the biggest barbecue this town has ever seen, and every law enforcement officer in the county is invited. State police, county deputies, city officers, anyone with a badge who wants to see what Sheriff Williams has been so concerned about. I looked directly into the camera for the final lines. If I am really the dangerous troublemaker she claims I am, then officers should come see for themselves. If she is telling the truth about illegal activities and public safety hazards, then she should have no problem with her fellow officers witnessing it firsthand. Everyone is welcome. The food is free, the conversation is honest, and the truth speaks for itself. I posted the video on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram simultaneously at 8 o'clock on Sunday evening. By the time I went to bed 2 hours later, It had been shared 43 times and had over 200 comments. I woke up Monday morning to discover it had gone viral. Overnight, the video had been shared nearly 1,000 times across all platforms. The comments section had become a battlefield where supporters and critics debated everything from police accountability to the right to peaceful assembly. But more importantly, people were sharing their own stories about interactions with Sheriff Karen. "She did the same thing to my family last year," wrote one commenter. "Harassment disguised as law enforcement. Finally, someone with the courage to stand up to her," added another. By Tuesday morning, the local newspaper had called asking for an interview. By Wednesday, the story had been picked up by the state newspaper and 2 television stations. Jenny, our contact inside the sheriff's department, texted me that Karen was in full panic mode, holding emergency meetings and making angry phone calls to anyone who would listen. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source: other law enforcement officers. Detective Williams from the state police shared the video with a comment that sent shockwaves through our small town. "Citizens have the right to peaceful assembly and community gatherings. If local law enforcement has concerns about public safety, those concerns should be addressed through proper channels, not harassment campaigns." Lieutenant Rodriguez from the neighboring county added, "Looking forward to Saturday. Good barbecue and honest conversation about community policing sound perfect." The momentum became unstoppable. Local businesses began offering to donate food and supplies. Maria Rodriguez announced she would cater authentic Mexican food. Mr. Peterson said he would bring enough potato salad to feed an army. But the most satisfying moment came Thursday evening when Sheriff Karen finally responded with her own social media post. Her statement was a defensive, bureaucratic mess that only made her look worse. Recent social media attacks on local law enforcement represent a dangerous trend toward disrespecting authority and undermining public safety. Citizens should address concerns through proper channels rather than public demonstrations designed to embarrass dedicated officers. The comments on her post were brutal. Even people who had previously stayed silent began sharing their own experiences with her harassment and abuse of power. By Friday morning, over 300 people had committed to attending Saturday's barbecue. The story had been picked up by national news outlets as an example of community activism and police accountability. Most importantly, Crawford called to tell me that both the state police investigation and FBI civil rights review had been expedited due to the public attention. "Whatever happened Saturday," he said, "Sheriff Karen's ability to operate in the shadows is over." As I fired up my smoker before dawn on Saturday morning, I knew we had already won the most important victory. We had forced the truth into the light. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, my quiet neighborhood street looked like a festival was about to begin. News vans lined the curb while reporters set up cameras and conducted interviews with neighbors who had been waiting months for this opportunity to tell their stories. The smell of barbecue smoke mixed with the energy of a community that had finally found its voice. Maria Rodriguez arrived early with 2 tables loaded with authentic Mexican dishes that smelled incredible. Tom brought a military-style organizational system that efficiently managed the growing crowd of volunteers. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had been terrified by Karen's illegal search, surprised everyone by showing up with homemade pies and a fierce determination to share her story with anyone who would listen. "I have not felt this hopeful in months," she told a television reporter who was documenting the community response. But the real validation began arriving at 11:30. Detective Williams from the state police was the first official vehicle to pull up, followed by two patrol cars from neighboring counties. The officers emerged with genuine curiosity and what appeared to be healthy appetites for good barbecue. "Smells amazing," Detective Williams said as he shook my hand. "We appreciate the invitation, and we are interested in hearing about the community concerns that brought us here." More officers continued arriving: city police from 3 different towns, county deputies from surrounding areas, even 2 federal agents who had been following the civil rights investigation. Each group was welcomed warmly by neighbors who had been waiting months to have honest conversations with law enforcement officers who were not Sheriff Karen. The contrast was stunning. These officers talked easily with residents, played games with children, and asked genuine questions about community needs and concerns. They represented everything law enforcement should be: approachable, professional, and focused on serving rather than intimidating. "This is what good policing looks like," Tom observed as he watched Lieutenant Rodriguez helping Emma and her friends organize a game of capture the flag. By noon, nearly 400 people had gathered in and around my backyard. The overflow crowd spilled onto the street, which had been unofficially closed by the sheer number of people present. Local businesses had donated drinks, ice, and additional tables. The high school band even showed up to provide music. And then at 12:30, Sheriff Karen arrived. She pulled up in her patrol car, alone, wearing civilian clothes that somehow made her look smaller and less intimidating than her uniform normally did. The crowd noise decreased noticeably as people recognized her, but conversations continued rather than stopping completely. I watched from across the yard as she stood beside her car for several long minutes, clearly uncomfortable with the size and energy of the gathering. Several officers approached her with friendly greetings, but her responses were stiff and defensive. Detective Williams walked over to me while keeping an eye on Karen's movements. "We have been conducting interviews all morning," he said quietly. "The pattern of harassment and abuse of power is undeniable. Multiple witnesses, documented evidence, and recorded radio communications that support every complaint." But Karen was not finished fighting. At 1:15, she made her way through the crowd toward my smoker, where I was serving brisket to a line of officers and neighbors. Her face was flushed, and her movements were sharp with barely controlled anger. "This is all very impressive," she announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "But public relations campaigns do not change the fact that this operation has been in violation of multiple municipal ordinances." The conversations around us stopped as people turned to listen. Several officers moved closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Sheriff Williams," Detective Williams interrupted smoothly, "perhaps you could share your specific concerns with me and my colleagues. We are here to observe and learn about community policing approaches." Karen looked trapped. She was surrounded by law enforcement professionals who had spent the morning witnessing exactly the opposite of what she had been claiming for months. Her victims were sharing their stories with credible officers who were taking notes and asking follow-up questions. "I have documented evidence of ongoing violations," she insisted, pulling out her familiar clipboard. That was when Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward with quiet courage that silenced the entire gathering. "Sheriff, you have been harassing my family for months with threats about my legal catering business. You told me neighbors were complaining about cooking smells, but I never received a single complaint from anyone except you." More voices joined in. Tom described the harassment about his flag display. Sarah shared the intimidation tactics Karen had used against her flower shop. One by one, Karen's victims spoke their truth in front of witnesses who could not be intimidated or silenced. The final moment came when Karen, clearly desperate and realizing she was losing control of the narrative, made one last attempt to assert her authority. "I want to see permits for this gathering," she demanded, her voice rising. "This is clearly a commercial operation without proper licensing." Detective Williams stepped forward with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of professional experience. "Sheriff Williams, I think it would be best if you and I had a private conversation about the ongoing investigation into harassment complaints filed against your department." The blood drained from Karen's face as she realized that her victims had not just organized a barbecue. They had built a case that law enforcement professionals were taking seriously. 3 weeks later, I was reading the newspaper on my front porch when Sheriff Karen's patrol car drove past for the last time. Her resignation had been announced the previous Friday, effective immediately, following the completion of both state and federal investigations into civil rights violations and abuse of power under color of law. The local newspaper headline read, "Sheriff resigns amid investigation into harassment allegations." But the real story was in the details that emerged during the investigation. Crawford had been right about the recorded radio communications. Every frivolous citation, every harassment patrol, every abuse of authority had been documented in official records that painted an undeniable picture of systematic misconduct. The state police investigation found evidence of 14 separate civil rights violations affecting multiple families in our community. The FBI Civil Rights Review resulted in a referral to federal prosecutors, though Karen avoided criminal charges by agreeing to resign and surrender her law enforcement certification permanently. More importantly, the investigation led to policy changes that would protect future citizens from similar abuse. The county implemented new oversight procedures for citation patterns, created an independent complaint review board, and established regular community policing forums to maintain open dialogue between law enforcement and residents. Deputy Martinez, who had been forced to deliver many of Karen's frivolous citations, was promoted to interim sheriff and immediately began rebuilding community trust through the kind of professional, respectful law enforcement our town deserved. "We are committed to serving the community, not intimidating it," he announced at his first public meeting as interim sheriff. The civil lawsuit settlements provided financial compensation for harassment victims, but more importantly, they established legal precedents that would make it harder for future officials to abuse their power with impunity. Maria Rodriguez used her settlement money to expand her catering business and hire 2 additional employees. Tom worked with the new sheriff's department to establish a veterans liaison program. Mrs. Henderson became an advocate for elderly residents' rights and worked with the county to create better protection against police harassment of vulnerable populations. But the most meaningful change was what happened in our neighborhood. The Saturday barbecues returned, bigger and better than ever. What had started as a family tradition became a genuine community institution that brought together neighbors who had been divided by fear and intimidation. Officers from the sheriff's department became regular attendees, building the kind of positive relationships between law enforcement and citizens that make communities safer and stronger. 6 months after Karen's resignation, we held our first annual Community Unity Barbecue. Officially sponsored by the county and attended by over 800 people, including the mayor, county commissioners, and law enforcement officers from across the region. Standing at my smoker, watching children play while their parents shared food and conversation with the officers who served them, I realized we had accomplished something much more important than getting revenge against a corrupt sheriff. We had proven that ordinary citizens, working together with truth and determination, could overcome abuse of power and create positive change in their community. Emma, now 9 years old and completely recovered from the trauma of Corinne's harassment, helped me serve barbecue to a long line of neighbors and friends. She had no memory of being afraid to play in her own backyard or wondering why the sheriff hated our family. "Daddy," she asked as we watched the sun set over our peaceful neighborhood, "why do you think Sheriff Corinne was so angry about our barbecues?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "Sometimes people get confused about what power is supposed to be used for," I finally said. "Real power comes from bringing people together and making things better. Sheriff Corinne thought power meant making people afraid and keeping them apart." As the last guests headed home and Sarah and I cleaned up the remnants of another successful gathering, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. The harassment and intimidation were over, replaced by genuine community connections and the kind of peaceful Saturday evenings I had always dreamed of. Corinne had moved away quietly, leaving no forwarding address and no explanation beyond her resignation letter. But her legacy lived on in the stronger community relationships and better government accountability measures that emerged from our fight for justice. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. Sometimes it is simply refusing to let someone else's darkness extinguish your light and working to make sure that light shines brighter than ever before.